On November 14th, the port of St. Petersburg is blown up, tankers are burning, and the Novatek terminal in Ust-Luga is on fire. The blast was heard near Putin's residence. The FSB is urgently evacuating facilities in the Leningrad region. Train stations and the power plant are under heavy fire.
Damn, later they hit the station. Wow, that was a blast. Shit, it really exploded right by the bridge.
Moscow and St. Petersburg are paralyzed, airports are closed, and railways have been blown up.
Looks like we're about to get kicked off the construction site. We got hit!
The ships are on fire. A strike on the residence.
Yeah, we hit it.
That's it.
Here, near the Rosneft area. In
2 kilometers is Putin's residence where he called Trump from, the operational command center. The Rushists are squealing.
Smoke! Arkady, well, how are you there? This is a new wave of strikes, which is breaking the Kremlin's military economy. There it is! Damn, it's burning hot. Nikit, it's right by your house!
Breaking news, friends. Ukraine continues to create blackouts in Russia, leaving people without power. The Moscow region, Voronezh and Belgorod.
Oh, it hit hard, damn.
Exploded, right?
Right by the bridge. Damn, they hit the train station.
Tankers are burning. The Novatek terminal in Ust-Luga is on fire. Moscow and St. Petersburg are paralyzed. Airports are closed. Oil refineries are in flames. Railways have been blown up. A series of precision strikes were carried out by the AFU on military and energy facilities. In Tuapse, a strike by naval drones hit the port and the pier. A Russian warship was blown up near Novoshakhtinsk. There's a fire at a petrochemical plant in Kazan. In Voronezh, 3 missile strikes hit CHP-1. Part of the city is without power. In Crimea, there was a detonation at an oil depot in Vardiskoye. A series of large-scale strikes on Russian territory. An energy crisis, collapse, blackouts. Russia's war economy is collapsing. New sanctions against Russia, the fall of Lukoil, and also Trump's upcoming special operation in Venezuela to overthrow the Maduro regime. And how this will affect oil prices, we'll discuss with top economist Igor Lipsits. Right now, over the past 12 days, we've attacked nearly 20 thermal power plants. The first blackout happened in the Moscow region, and yesterday there were blackouts in Voronezh and Belgorod. In general, how do blackouts affect the lives of Russians?
Well, there are basically 2 lines of impact here. The first line is the impact on people's mood. We have noticed with interest that generally speaking, the mood is changing. Moreover, it's changing even according to official sociological data, which, always tries to paint a prettier picture, but you can't cover everything up. Otherwise, it just wouldn't look good. So even they admit that Russians are starting to get very tired of the war, and the number of those who support it unconditionally has dropped quite a lot. The number of people who are tired of the war exceeded 40%, and sometimes the figures are even more significant. So, that initial attitude of, well, it's happening somewhere out there, it doesn't concern us, is changing. That attitude is starting to fade because people are feeling that the war is having an impact, prices are rising, more and more money is being taken away, and the overall negative situation in the economy is affecting everyone. In other words, a certain fatigue is building up, and the more blows like these that have a widespread impact and lower the quality of life, the less people will feel that the war is happening somewhere abroad and doesn't concern us. Instead, there will be a growing sense that this problem really needs to be resolved somehow. So that's the first effect. The second effect is, of course, economic, because shutting down the power grid doesn't just create difficulties for households and the residential sector. It also means factories stop working, it creates problems generating income, and these difficulties lead to a reduction in overall profits, which in turn causes the tax base to shrink. And the financial situation in Russia is already so bad that just look, Russia has already passed the budget for next year in its first reading. And before they even managed to pass it, they already had to urgently make adjustments. And not by a small amount, about 7 trillion, because they made a budget that was as focused on the war as possible, cutting back on the civilian sector. A terrible outcry began within their own government circles. They urgently started reallocating some funds to stop the outcry. In other words, the situation is such that the financial losses are already so great that even the state no longer fully controls its financial situation. So all of this keeps accumulating. Debts are growing, the state deficit is increasing, the national debt is rising, which, by the way, is something people in Russia usually don't even think about. It's a concept that's rather poorly understood there. But in reality, these are all issues that will continue to affect the lives of Russians for a long time. So all these kinds of damages inflicted on energy systems, it's a painful subject. It's not fatal yet, but it is painful because overall it undermines the stability of Russian life, which Putin clings to so desperately.
Igor Vladimirovich, what's happening with Russia's energy sector, especially in the context of strikes on refineries and ports? Because we've attacked Ust-Luga and now Tuapse. They report that the sea drone attack on the port in Tuapse has practically halted its operations. The situation is complicated. Moreover, we see that Mongolia is suffering greatly because it used to import petroleum products from the Russian Federation. Now Russia is forced to import petroleum products from Belarus and China. How painful is this for the Russian economy right now?
Well, it is painful because there was a sense that Russia was generally protected from Ukrainian attacks. After all, it's far away, and this is a vast territory far from Ukraine. Trouble wouldn't reach there. There are oil refineries in Siberia, and in general, products can be transported. There are pipelines. In short, there was this sense, how should I put it, of a vast, resilient economy that no one could harm. It turned out that this was an illusion, that in modern warfare, damage can be inflicted even without heavy missile attacks. And now we're witnessing a rather unpleasant situation where, how should I put it, there's a kind of psychological pressure from local authorities on enterprise leaders. They're demanding that all major Russian enterprises set up their own air defense systems around themselves, and at their own expense, no less. So now there's a dual air defense system emerging, one state-run and one private. It's a rather unusual situation, and of course, it's a strange one. Because first of all, where would you even get enough air defense systems to cover all major Russian enterprises? There simply isn't that much military equipment available. Then again, these are additional expenses that companies will naturally pass on to the prices of their products. These are rather painful issues, but I do understand the local authorities' point of view. It's important to understand that when drone attacks target industrial facilities, it's not just a local technological accident at that particular site. Many of these facilities contain rather hazardous substances, and during fires or such accidents, these substances can be released into the air. That's why there's a risk of a chemical threat to nearby populated areas as a result of drone attacks on certain industrial enterprises. This isn't chemical warfare, but the consequences could be very similar. For example, chlorine releases into the air, you can look it up in civil defense textbooks, can cause some very unpleasant effects, and so on. So in this sense, it's simply impossible for the military to provide protection for all facilities across Russia. And Russia has really found itself in a situation, as military analysts correctly point out, where for the first time the size of Russia's territory has become a weakness for it, a weak element of its military system rather than a strength. Previously, when it was all about infantry, this was actually an advantage. By the time they arrived, by the time you transported everything, it took an awfully long time. But the drone war has changed the situation, and for the first time, the vast territory with many technological facilities, impossible to cover them all, has become a problem for Russia because now it has to choose whether to use its air defense system to protect the military, the capital, or industrial sites. In other words, Russia has found itself in a war it did not expect, which it was not prepared for, and in this war it will suffer losses, and this leads to long-term consequences. Well, look at what we see happening in the oil sector. A truly dire situation has arisen because there is now a shortage of motor fuel within Russia itself, yet Russia has intergovernmental agreements to supply motor fuel to Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan, and due to the shortage in Russia, these two countries have been left without fuel. So people there who had been doing well suddenly found themselves in trouble. And now there's no happiness because you can't fill up anything. And Russia, despite having a shortage on its own territory, started sending fuel there. Because of the intergovernmental agreements, at the same time, look at how this situation plays out. Officially, there is a ban on the export of motor fuel in Russia. That is, exporting is not allowed. But according to intergovernmental agreements, it seems you can. So on the one hand, it's forbidden, but on the other hand, they're exporting it anyway. But I mean, what are Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan supposed to just die because of Russia's war? That's why they sent tankers, whole trains with fuel over there. But this only makes the shortage in Russia worse. So it's pretty hard to say what will happen next, but it's also hard to fix this quickly. There's no equipment, and besides, these are additional costs that will again be added to the production cost of gasoline and diesel fuel, which will, in turn, push prices up. So there are a lot of unpleasant issues here. Moreover, since Russian oil companies can't send oil to refineries, they've started exporting more crude oil instead. As a result, the scale of production in Russia will simply be reduced for a long time. Accordingly, the consequences of the fuel shortage will not last long. It's hard to say whether they'll be able to overcome them. Most likely they won't. So overall, it's quite an unpleasant situation. And Russia can't live without fuel. It's such a vast country. Besides, if you know, there are places in Russia called the far north. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but in the far north, people never turn off their car engines for the whole winter. That is, the engine runs around the clock because if it freezes, you won't be able to thaw it out until spring. That's why fuel reserves have to be very large. If there are any disruptions, it poses a threat to the very survival of people in Russia's northern regions, as they say. So overall, the consequences are quite unpleasant and difficult to resolve. That's what's happening with this market.
Igor Vladimirovich, you've always said that the time would come when Russians would be heating their homes with wood stoves. Has that time come now when we see that winter is coming? What's your opinion?
So far, Russia still treats my predictions with skepticism. Although a woman wrote to me recently from Vladivostok, she said, "We thought about it here and my husband actually agreed with you. You won't believe it, but we moved into an old house. It's an old building and there are chimneys built into the walls. We tapped on them, found them, and now, if necessary, we know exactly where to connect a wood-burning stove." But of course, people living in the big apartment buildings in Moscow have a hard time believing in such an idea. But in reality, anything is possible. A blackout would create a huge problem because in Moscow, if something happens, there's not even anywhere to gather people, you see? Usually, in such situations, people are brought together in sports facilities and heat generators are set up there. But in Moscow, there are so many people that you can't fit everyone into stadiums, and there are no alternative systems. And if there are also strikes on the power grid, in other words, you won't be able to turn on an electric heater, and in many cases, what will happen is an instant burnout of all electrical systems. Well, how can I put it? You have to understand that there are a lot of old cities in Russia. And in old cities, there are old utility systems. I remember once I read something and found it terribly amusing. Well, amusing from an economist's point of view, though for ordinary people it's not so funny, that in the city of St. Petersburg, there is an energy police force. It's hard to grasp, but the thing is, the city is old, the utility infrastructure is very old, and the cable network is rather weak. Meanwhile, people who have started living well-off lives in St. Petersburg began to enhance their homes. And enhancing one's home always means increased electricity consumption, which is one of the most important indicators of comfort in life. So people started installing heated floors, air conditioning systems, and some energy-indulgent individuals even put saunas in their apartments. And this leads to such an increase in load that, as you can imagine, the fuses in your apartment are the first to blow. You install special fuses, then the fuses on the stairwells blow, so you put in a bypass there, but then the whole neighborhood goes out. So the energy police of St. Petersburg catch these heavy consumers, those who demand too much, and take measures against them. Moreover, Russia has now introduced a tiered electricity payment system to force people to consume less energy. Now, an increased fee will be introduced, and apparently the minimum threshold for electricity consumption will be significantly reduced so that people don't use too much electricity. In other words, they're going to hit people hard in the wallet for living comfortably so they won't live so carefree anymore. So, in this sense, the situation of losing a comfortable way of life is developing in Russia, and it's quite difficult to stop this process. It will only intensify.
Igor Vladimirovich, one of the most interesting topics is social protests. Here's what we're seeing: a nationalist march. A march of Russian nationalists recently took place in the Moscow region. Everyone discussed it very thoroughly. What do you associate this with? Are these certain protests against someone, and how much can they influence the turbulence in Russia?
Well, this always creates a very complicated situation. In general, the Russian question is always very explosive in Russia because, well, these nationalists always hit a sensitive spot for the Russian Federation. They say that in Russia, for example, there are national entities, Tatar, Bashkir, but there is no Russian one. In other words, there isn't a single Russian republic. There is no Russian republic in the Russian Federation. So Russians don't have their own state. This is a recurring topic. that we are being discriminated against here. We are the state forming nation, but we are being discriminated against. We are not being taken into account. And this recurring topic, it sometimes flares up, sometimes dies down. During times of crisis, it intensifies because people try to find, how should I put it, some kind of foundation for self respect. There is no other foundation. Only national identity can serve as one. And now we are seeing this surge again. It happens periodically. I have experienced this throughout my life. Many times in the 1990s, for example, there was a strong rise of a group called Pamyat. Those who are older might remember, which at that time was mainly fighting against Jews, shouting at us, Jews, pack your bags, go to the train station, go to Israel. In the end, their shouting even reached me. Well, this is a story that is in a way understandable, but this is a constant theme, one that never goes away. And what is happening now? All this war and the hysteria around the war, stirred up by Putin, this whole search for enemies. It encourages the darkest forces in society. And from this arises this powerful movement. It was the same way in the Russian Empire. If you remember the Black Hundreds who existed under the leadership of the Tsar's people, all of this happened a long time ago, and it constantly exists in Russia. But sometimes it is suppressed because it is very dangerous for Russia, where many nations live. And sometimes the state doesn't have enough strength to suppress it. And then this dark theme in Russian life, these dark forces, the dark part of society gains confidence in itself and becomes more active. Right now in Russia, it's exactly such a period when this dark force in society is becoming more active.
And what do you think about the migrant protests? We saw in New Moscow, for example, there was a whole brawl using improvised objects, shovels, pipes. After that, the FSB, together with the National Guard, organized joint raids against migrants. Igor Vladimirovich, this anti-migrant policy in central Moscow, how likely is it to also lead to some kind of turbulence, even from all economic and social perspectives?
This is a very complicated issue. The thing is, Russia, it has found itself in a kind of trouble, connected to the fact that the country is experiencing a process of depopulation. It's a rather difficult, even frightening process. Interestingly, when I mention the numbers for Russia's future depopulation, an incredible number of people get upset. People criticize me terribly for my words because I say frightening things. But I was pleased to notice that the well-known Russian demographer Alexei Raksha completely quotes the same figures as I do. He gives the same numbers, the same assessments, and they are quite alarming. These estimates suggest that over the next 70 years, that is, by the end of this century, Russia's population will be cut in half. This, of course, creates a major problem. After all, Russia's vast economy was designed for a different population size. The population is declining, and soon there will be no one left to work. And the question arises, what should be done? That's why, of course, there's hysteria. Let's have more children. But somehow this isn't really working out. Despite all the appeals and even incentives, the birth rate in Russia isn't increasing. It remains low and is even declining. Again, demographers say that Russia hasn't seen such a low birth rate in the past 15 years, if not longer. So basically, we're rolling back quite far. In this sense, it's a big problem. So some kind of workforce is needed to maintain the level of economic activity that has been achieved. That means migrants need to be brought in. But this is where it all starts to, how should I put it? There's discord within the authorities of the Russian Federation. Some of these authorities are shouting that migrants must be brought in, otherwise we won't survive, we won't be able to work. And there will be no one to work on construction sites. And they are organizing the mass importation of people from India and I think even from Nigeria. They want to bring them in. It's a very interesting topic. In the context of Russian racism, this is quite an interesting topic. But on the other hand, there's some other faction which is even led by the Russian Orthodox Church, which insists on no migrants at all. Migrants dilute the identity of the Russian people, create the mass spread of other religions, which threatens the position of the Russian Orthodox Church. That's why no migrants, deport everyone, deprive them all of opportunities. The Russian government is balancing between them. Right now, it has taken, a kind of compromise position. Let them come, but without families, without children. So you come here for a work shift, do your job, and then leave. It wasn't like this before. People used to stay in Russia, gradually bring over their children and wives, then start applying for citizenship. This somewhat compensated for the decline in the core population, but now that won't happen, which means the process of depopulation in Russia will only accelerate. Well, here's the picture. It's hard to solve problems without migrants, but they don't want migrants. It is not clear at all how this is resolved.
Igor Vladimirovich, we can now say how serious the sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil are. We saw that Timchenko wanted to acquire these foreign subsidiaries, but they didn't let him. Not Timchenko.
Don't need Timchenko? Go ahead, tell us. No, not Timchenko. The whole intrigue was precisely that. Formally, it wasn't Timchenko. That is, the company Gunvor was indeed created together with Timchenko, but Timchenko understood that he would fall under sanctions. And he urgently sold his share a few days before the occupation of Crimea. In other words, he was warned, and as they say, he formally withdrew so as not to fall under sanctions and not lose anything. So he formally left the company Goldmar, and officially he is not there. But that's just on paper. Whether that's actually the case or not, we don't know. There is always what we can call a hidden owner, a disguised proprietor in the general world of business. This is done. Lawyers know how to build such structures, so it's impossible to say for sure whether Timchenko is there or not, whether Timchenko is involved to the end. Officially, no. So, yeah, there was hope that Gonvard could buy it and no one would say anything. But as you can see, it didn't work out. They weren't allowed to. And now, of course, Lukoil is in big trouble. I mean, where is Lukoil and where is Timchenko? Well, now, as they say, Lukoil is paying the price for Timchenko. They'll have to sell off these assets, apparently in pieces with very heavy losses. And, well, how should I put it? This now poses a threat to the very existence of Lukoil as a company. Because these foreign assets that ended up under sanctions, as far as we can tell, accounted for almost 30% of the company's revenue. 30%? Losing any share of ownership, assets, or revenue is a huge problem for a large company. And by the way, Lukoil was already not in a very good financial position. Last year, their profits dropped sharply, just like the rest of the Russian oil industry. And now, with the loss of these assets, this income, this profit from foreign assets, it could be a situation where Lukoil might end up bankrupt. Those are scary words. I don't know if it will happen or not, but the threat is real. That's why, as far as I've heard, there are now rumors going around Moscow that it's over for Lukoil. After all, this is the second largest oil company, and any problems within this company will have painful repercussions across the entire Russian oil industry and on all the oil-related revenues of the Russian budget. Right now, there's a dramatic intrigue unfolding, and we're watching it with great interest.
Igor Vladimirovich, do you personally feel that China and India are truly ready and willing to stop buying Russian oil entirely because of the new sanctions imposed by Trump? Or, in your opinion, is the situation regarding this issue still just as discouraging and uncertain as it was before?
I can't say I feel that, but I can allow for the possibility. I can allow for the possibility because, on the global economic stage, everyone looks out for their own interests first. That's just the way it is. And as far as we can tell, neither India nor China feels any special friendship toward Russia, certainly not to the extent that they would buy from Russia to their own detriment. They bought it because it was profitable for them. I've come across calculations showing that India benefited and saved about $15 to $17 billion on cheap Russian oil. That's serious money. Because there were big discounts, price cuts on Russian oil. India made very good money on this. So they bought cheap oil at a discount compared to other suppliers, produced petroleum products, and then instead of Russia, sold these products to Europe. Again, they made good money, so it's clear that they were happy to buy and significantly increased their purchase volumes. Before the war, they didn't buy nearly as much, but during the war, they just went all in on Russia, or rather on its cheap oil, with a fierce and tender love. But now, of course, if they're offered an alternative, they'll turn away from Russia. And they are being offered an alternative. First of all, Iran is very eager to supply them. And Iran is strongly asking the Americans to lift at least some of the sanctions on oil exports so they can supply oil to India and China and replace Russia. In other words, as they say, we can come to an agreement. It's beneficial for you and it's beneficial for me. As they say, I'm ready to help you squeeze out Russia. And the second blow that Russia might receive is coming from Saudi Arabia, which the Russian press loved to portray as a gentle friend. Such a gentle oil friend, a kind of oil girlfriend of the Russian Federation. It turned out to be completely untrue. This oil girlfriend, Saudi Arabia, announced that it is very ready to bring its reserve production capacities back online and fully replace Russian oil supplies to India and China. They have spare capacity. In this sense, Russia's position in the Indian and Chinese markets is not without alternatives. Let me put it this way, carefully. There are other suppliers, and in general, it's possible that Russia will lose these markets. This is already a big problem for Russia. There are already reports coming in that there is a lot of panic in Russia because of the possible reduction in oil supplies to India, because everything will go to hell. Pardon the non-economic expression. The entire financial structure of the Russian state In that case, they will have to take some emergency measures, drastically cut social programs, and it's not even clear what could possibly be cut. In other words, it's a very serious problem, and they will have to carry out a major devaluation of the ruble to generate empty rubles for financing the state budget. So the threat to Russia is that even if only India cuts its purchases by half, it would already be almost a financial catastrophe, and it's unclear how to solve it.
Igor Vladimirovich, what is your opinion regarding Venezuela? Will Trump be able to change the regime? Is it possible that Maduro will flee to Moscow? And what will we have here in Moscow then? Yanukovych, Assad, Maduro, everyone who can, all equal, like on a scoreboard. Putin is with them.
Yeah, tell me about it.
So, hypothetically speaking, do you think that Venezuela could really change its leadership? The regime could fall, and then to restore relations with America and the oil market, the situation with oil would change dramatically.
Well, anything is possible. As far as I understand, right now, American lawyers are looking for at least some kind of, how should I put it, legal justification for aggression against Venezuela. But as we know, with Trump, these things happen quite easily. So I can't rule out that they will eventually find some pretext that would allow them to intervene in Venezuela. For the sake of protecting the interests of the American nation, anything is possible. The idea is simple. After all, Venezuela is very rich. Oil has practically kept it afloat. As far as we understand, it's the richest. In terms of oil reserves, they're competing with Canada for who has more. It's not as cheap as in Saudi Arabia, but it's well processed in the US. As far as I know, Venezuela has heavy oil, not the light kind, but American refineries know how to process it. That's always been the case. And as far as I know, there is already some movement, and some oil shipments from Venezuela to the US are already happening. It's written very carefully that this is only the case if the revenues from these operations do not go to the Venezuelan government. It's a rather funny situation, but that's how things are for now. For the US, this would be a good scenario. They would then quickly ramp up oil production in Venezuela. After all, it was infrastructure, and it has been destroyed or damaged. But as they say with an American oil company, it's entirely possible to restore it. And then Venezuelan oil will go accordingly to the refineries. That means to the US, and American oil will be exported all over the world. So such a scenario is possible. Therefore, of course, the possibility of intervention cannot be ruled out. So we're watching with interest. If this happens and Venezuela returns to the global oil market, then of course the rate of decline in oil prices worldwide could accelerate, and a very low level could become entrenched. Look, right now the forecasts are that the price will be somewhere next year at the level of $60 per barrel, but there are even more alarming forecasts from the International Energy Agency that's $52 per barrel. For Russia, these are very alarming numbers because the total costs for oil extraction and transportation in Russia are currently, according to various estimates, somewhere around $40 to $45 for many fields. If your price is 52, and that's Brent, not Urals, and there's also a discount of $12 or $14 from Brent, then you'll end up spending more to extract the oil than you get from selling it. In other words, the oil industry will become unprofitable. Many enterprises will be operating at a loss. Many wells will have to be shut down. It's a serious disaster. This threat is hanging over Russia, and no one knows what to do about it. It's clear that Russia's prospects in the oil industry weren't very good to begin with, and now, by destabilizing its position on the global oil market because of the war and giving its enemies an opportunity to take away Russia's share of the global market, it has driven itself into a huge long-term predicament.
Igor Vladimirovich, how do you assess the prospects of the 20th package of European Union sanctions? Because everyone is already saying that the 20th is being prepared, but many economists point out that the 19th hasn't even taken effect yet. There's a huge shadow fleet and no one is fighting it. Is there no toolkit for controlling these sanctions? I would like to hear your analysis.
Well, what can I say? The only consistently positive thing I see about these packages is that in every case, they confirm Europe's willingness to punish Russia and support Ukraine. That's what's important to me. As for whether they work or not, it's all very complicated. Some things always work out and some things don't. Because with many things, it's not enough just to designate, announce, and establish them. They need to be implemented. And we keep saying that the tools for enforcing these sanctions are rather weak. The implementation is poor. In other words, European bureaucracies can come up with sanctions, but creating a mechanism for enforcement that costs money. That means if you impose a sanction, you then have to allocate funds for some kind of enforcement agency, inspection, or body to combat violations of these sanctions. So the European Union wants to punish Russia but doesn't want to spend money on enforcing this sanctions regime. That's the problem, you see. That's why so much of it remains just declarative and is circumvented. We understand this as well. So, in general, these sanction packages are already met with a certain level of irony. But again, from the standpoint that they are demonstrating Europe's continued willingness to condemn the aggressor and support Ukraine, that's a good thing. But we shouldn't have any illusions that the European Commission knows everything so well or does everything perfectly. For me, what's happening with the Russian foreign currency reserves is actually a rather sad story, because these could be used to finance Ukraine, those notorious 140 billion, which can't be put into action in any way because the European Union is astonishingly inflexible, astonishingly unconstructive, and can't manage to resolve anything. I proposed my own mechanism for how this money could be converted so that it could be used to finance Ukraine. Norway has already proposed its own mechanism, but there is still no decision so far. This, of course, is extremely surprising and disappointing.
By the way, this is exactly what I wanted to discuss with you in the final part of our conversation. Specifically about this right now, Fico, I believe, made a statement that Russia's war against Ukraine could last several more years if the European Union makes a decision to transfer Russia's frozen assets to Ukraine so that Ukraine could have the economic means to wage war against Russia. But this if, as I understand it, the current stumbling block is in Belgium, because they were planning, the European Commission was planning, Belgium initially agreed, but then they wanted to receive certain guarantees. Igor Vladimirovich, why is it that at this moment Belgium cannot make a decision? Because as I understand it, the majority of the frozen Russian assets are located in Belgium? Well,
Belgium, because it is protecting its own interests, and in this sense I completely support and understand them, and I do not in any way condemn Belgium or its prime minister, because the money is on their territory and they bear legal responsibility to Russia for these funds, and they're being told to hand it over. But they say, what if later Russia manages to prove again that it has the right to this money? Then these 140 billion would have to be paid out of Belgium's own funds, and they are not willing to agree to that. They say there are risks, so if there are risks, then this problem needs to be solved. There are different ways to solve it. I suggested creating a risk insurance system for this. It's entirely possible. I even know how to do all of this. I've talked about this more than once on Ukrainian TV channels. I've spoken about it with Fagin and at NIAN in the presence of your representatives from the Ukrainian government, but nothing really came of it. There was no such decision about insuring this loan, so that Belgium wouldn't be afraid that if anything happens, it would have to cover it alone. And since that's not the case, they keep saying, European Union guys, come on, share the responsibility with us, ensure these 140 protect us. And the European Union says, no, maybe someday we'll compensate you somehow, but for now, just give it away for free. Well, naturally, the Belgians don't want to, so you see an interesting twist of fate has come up. So the second option I suggested was to insure it, and now in Norway, there's an idea to use their national fund, which is over $1 trillion, to cover it. They want to provide a guarantee for these 140 so that Belgium won't be afraid. In the event that Russia starts demanding the 140 billion, the Norwegian sovereign fund will compensate Belgium for that money. So in other words, a reasonable solution exists, but the European Commission hasn't made any decision about it yet. They're simply trying to force Belgium to agree to just give it away for nothing. And naturally, Belgium doesn't want to. It's a strange deadlock, in my opinion, purely bureaucratic and foolish. I don't see anything else here. There is a solution, and it's not very complicated. But so far, it hasn't been implemented, even though it could have been. And as for what Slovakia is saying, well, let's ask a question. If we don't give money to Ukraine, will Putin immediately stop fighting? He intends to keep fighting for many years until he achieves the complete destruction of Ukraine. So what are Slovakia and Hungary suggesting then? That Ukraine should be eliminated as a state? Would that make life easier for Slovakia? Well, we need to understand what's really behind this decision. That's why the real question here is that we can and should help Ukraine with this money.
Iglandia, do you believe that in the near future there is a real possibility that Ukraine will actually receive these frozen Russian assets?
Well, I don't see any, insurmountable obstacles, if I can put it that way. Everything can be resolved. If there's a will in business, we always find 24 ways to get around any obstacle. That's precisely the art of a business consultant, the art of a manager, to get around the obstacles that life throws at you, and all of business is about. Problems that arise, and finding ways around those problems is the task of any manager. So there's nothing that would fundamentally prevent us from doing this. It's just that, how should I put it? There's very little flexibility and perhaps a lack of qualification among the European experts and the European Commission, who either don't understand the problems or don't want to solve them. There's also, how can I say, a very unpleasant contradiction. On the one hand, Europe clearly wants to help Ukraine in its war with Russia, but on the other hand, it doesn't want to see Russia destroyed. This greatly reduces the effectiveness of all sanction mechanisms. But the Northern Union doesn't know what it wants, just like in the United States. No one knows whether they want the destruction of Russia, the collapse of the Russian regime, or if they just want to weaken Putin a little so that he stops fighting, but everything else stays the same because they're afraid of Russia falling apart. And as long as there is no unified approach, sometimes they act, sometimes they don't, sometimes they punish, sometimes they don't enforce anything. That's the problem. That's the reality we live in. That's why, even though sanction packages are being adopted, Russia still manages to earn some money from oil exports.
Dear audience, please like our tandem, write in the comments if there are at least some words of support for Ukraine, and also let us know where you are watching us from. Top economist Igor Lipsits breaks down the Russian economy and what lies ahead for it. Of course, we are waiting for the fall of the Venezuelan regime. Perhaps at our next meeting, we will discuss whether Maduro has joined the company of dictators and war criminals in Moscow or not. Igor Vladimirovich, thank you. And as always, I hope to see you again soon.
All the best. Take care.